Good morning, church. Good morning again, and thank you for the privilege to be able to preach, even if it is in a virtual setting, not in a normal meeting place. It is starting to feel a bit like things are coming back to normal in a little bit, but at least it's been a privilege to be able to have a few visits with family and friends, and to know we can travel a bit again. And for us to have kids back at school, my kids are on a 3-term schedule, so they only went back to school physically this week for the first time since March. And I can tell you that as much as they were looking forward to it, as much as we were as well, there was a lot of uncertainty. Our son Ryan, he loved doing online schooling actually, so he wanted to carry on doing it, but we said he had to go back to school. So when I dropped him off on that first day, I could see he was very nervous. And I was also nervous, to be honest. And to watch him go off armed with his little mask and his sanitizer to fend off any viruses that might want to attack. But by the time we picked him up that afternoon, he transformed into a beaming little boy. And he loved every minute of what is admittedly a very weird and different school day, but he loved it. And the experience was similar for my daughter. She started off the day uncertain. The first day she went back, even though she was more keen to get back to see her friends. But when we picked Stacy up that afternoon, she informed us she had just had the best day ever. So what a blessing that was. So many of us are back into full swing again, or as much as we can be. But no matter how well you've settled into this new routine or the new structure or new schedule, I think we all agree that there's a lot of uncertainty around. Economically, although there's already been some real pain, I fear that unfortunately the worst is probably yet to come. And we'll see whole industries start disappearing, and unfortunately the jobs they created with them. It's safe to say that these are definitely some of the most uncertain economic times we're facing. Socially, yes, we can meet in small groups again, we can see our families, but it seems like we have a long way to go before we can return to the large, unhindered gatherings and celebrations, events and occasions that gave so much of us, or so many of us, such joy. Things like weddings, concerts, theaters, parties, and watching and even partaking in sports events. Social gatherings are still uncertain. Spiritually, although I hope that we've all come to realize why Paul tells us not to forsake meeting together, and hopefully that debate will be well and truly settled after this. But spiritually, these times of uncertainty have also already affected us in so many ways. There have been a lot of positive spiritual lessons to be learned during this time. And it has and it will continue to be a time of testing of our faith. It will be a time when so many biblical verses, promises, stories that we know so well, they're going to become even more relevant and real. You see, for many of us in our current Christian culture and circles, and I speak for myself, I think life had actually become quite comfortable. And sometimes I'd even go as far to say trivial in some aspects. Don't get me wrong, we faced trials, we had difficult times, and I'm not saying life was a complete picnic. But when this crisis hit, it put a lot of things into perspective, especially for me being in a financial field. A lot of life consisted of budgets and forecasts and 5-year and even 10-year plans. And although in the past most of those plans were never quite spot on, they were probably not far from the truth in the end. Now almost all those plans have gone out the window, and not many people will hazard a guess as to what will happen next month, never mind in 5 or 10 years' time. So don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with planning. Planning is good. The Bible even tells us to plan diligently. And it implies we would be foolish not to plan and not to count the costs before starting a project. We just have to look at the example of Joseph and how God saved millions of lives through the plan that he put in place in Egypt before and during the famine. But this crisis has highlighted for me that maybe our plans have been elevated to a status that is inappropriate. We read in James 4, verse 13 to 15, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that." Wow. What a passage that we've read so many times. But this year it's been more relevant than ever before. How many plans we've had that we will go here and there, and that those plans have just been completely stopped. And then in Proverbs, we read, Proverbs 19:21, we read that many are the plans in a man's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. And earlier in Proverbs 16 verse 9, it tells us, we can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. None of these verses condemn planning or working hard or aiming for something or anything like that, but they do warn us not to think that just because we make a plan it will happen. But what I want to look at quickly today, in the light of all these plans going awry, is an effective approach, I believe, to living and dealing with times of uncertainty. I mentioned that I've come to realize that many of my aspects of life are, I said, trivial or maybe insignificant. And one of the reasons why I say that is because I tried a quick exercise of measuring my life so far against some of the characters in the Bible. And yes, there's probably a reason why they are written about and why they are in the Bible. But it also helped me to stop and think before complaining or falling into the trap of thinking that this crisis is unique, or this crisis that nobody has ever faced a trial like this. You see, there were many people in the Bible who faced a lot more uncertain times. Just for example, we look at the life of Noah. Boy, did he face uncertainty. He was told to build an ark, which would probably take him between 50 and 70 years, and he didn't really know why he was doing it. Look at Abraham. He had to leave his home country, pack up everything and go. And he wasn't told go here. He was told to go, and he didn't know where he was going to end up. Naomi, she lost her husband and 2 sons. And during those times, there probably wasn't a more uncertain situation to be in than to be a widow, because culture dictated that you were amongst the lowest classes of people, and you honestly did not know where your next meal was coming from. Joseph, I mentioned him before, but boy, did he face unbelievable times of uncertainty in his life. First, he was thrown into a well, uncertain what's going to happen. Then he's taken out the well, sold into slavery by his brothers, gone to Egypt. What's going to happen? Things start going a little bit better. What happens? He gets imprisoned, falsely accused, falsely convicted, and imprisoned. And probably the guy who is first in line of uncertainty in the Old Testament was poor old Job. I think there must have been a time in his life that the only thing that was certain for him was that he would be facing a new trial, and the uncertainty was what that trial would be. But then I also realized that these biblical examples weren't given to make us feel inadequate or to make our lives feel like less, but rather they're given as examples of how we should approach life. They're lessons, and in this case, how to face uncertainty. And from many of the good biblical examples, I can see 3 clear principles that we need to follow when we face uncertainty. So today I want to illustrate these principles from some of the experiences specifically that the Israelites had and their leaders over a few years. So these 3 principles to follow when facing uncertainty. The first principle is to acknowledge your own limitations. We need to acknowledge that we are not God. We are limited. And I'm going to start off with the bad news. The bad news for you today is that you probably won't be able to successfully navigate through this situation on your own. That is the bad news. And unfortunately, so often the world tells us we must make it on our own. We get mired and, we hold up those who didn't need any help from anybody else. I did it all on my own. But that approach to uncertainty and that approach to life is actually not biblical at all. And it's not biblical for two reasons. And the first reason being that we are told we need to cling to the one who knows your future, who knows our future. To illustrate this, I love the story involving Moses when the Israelites were fighting the Amalekites. And as long as Moses held up his staff with his hands, then the Israelites had the advantage. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites had the upper hand and they would start winning the battle. Probably not the most strategic way to win a battle and probably wasn't going to make it into a book like The Art of War. But by lifting his staff, Moses was symbolically acknowledging that God was always with them and that he alone was in control. Like Moses, when we find ourselves in a battle or a situation or this uncertainty, like these situations we're going to face, that we're not equipped to handle, we mustn't bury our head in the sand. We should look at the situation, observe what's going on, but don't ever let it stop us from clinging to God's authority and pursuing what God has promised us. The beautiful thing, though, is that the story doesn't stop there, this story. Because as Moses is holding his arms up and the Israelites are winning the battle, his arms started to get tired and he couldn't hold the staff up any longer by himself. So what happens? Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit on, and they stood on each side of him holding his hands up. What an incredible picture of allowing trusted people to come alongside you during a difficult time. We need to allow trusted people to come alongside us. Like Moses, we are not created to endure hard times and uncertainty alone. So maybe you need to ask God during this uncertain time, is this maybe an opportunity for you to partner with somebody in your story, for God to be glorified in the end by providing someone like Aaron and Hur to hold up your arms in battle, and ultimately to lift your hands in worship as you see and acknowledge God's deliverance in this victory. So the first principle is to acknowledge our own limitations, and we do that by clinging first to God and then allowing trusted people to come alongside us. The second principle that we see from some of these biblical characters who faced uncertainty is to lay down our expectations. So I'm going to just build on that. So lay down our expectations. We are generally not good at waiting as people. If you want to argue with me about that, I think this period of lockdown has proven that beyond any doubt. There's been so many frustrated people. We've all been getting cabin fever as we wait for what feels like forever, but in the end, it's not actually that long in the context of things. If you've ever felt frustrated by an uncertain season that lasts longer than you anticipated, you're definitely not alone, and definitely not today. We can get so focused on our own disappointment that we forget that God is in control. Again, when we look at Moses' life, now we look at Moses and the Israelites as a people, we unfortunately see an example of expectations getting in the way of waiting for God's timing. Why do I say that? The Israelites had waited for 400 years. 400 years to be delivered from slavery in Egypt. That is a long time to wait. But God delivers them, but He doesn't take them directly to the promised land. First, they have to camp at the base of Mount Sinai while God instructs Moses on the law. And as Moses, he goes up the mountain to receive the law from God, we read in Exodus, that, I don't think I put it on a slide, I'll read it for you, that when Moses failed to come back down the mountain right away, and I love that they didn't wait, right away. The people went to Aaron. Look, they said, make us some gods who can lead us. This man Moses, who brought us here from Egypt, has disappeared. We don't know what's happened to him. We read, and that's from Exodus 32, verse 1. And this is only a few days after they've been rescued, and even less days after they've declared that they would do everything the Lord has told them to do. In Exodus 24, they were declaring their undying commitment to God. It was probably only about 40 days. So after 400 years, they couldn't wait 40 days for Moses to come back down. Their delayed expectations led to poor decisions. They thought that God had forgotten his people and his promises. But he hadn't forgotten them. He was just preparing them for his promises. Remember that with God, your waiting is never wasted. Listen to that again. Your waiting is never wasted. If you find yourself weary from waiting, which I think many of us have felt recently, rather do what the Israelites forgot to do. Because so often we're waiting for the next thing to happen. But there's two things you can do. And the first is to look for evidence of God's presence in your waiting. We often sing that song, He's in the waiting. He's in the waiting. God is there with you in the waiting. He hasn't abandoned you. He hasn't forgotten you. And the other thing to do is to look back on what He's already done. Every single one of us has some sort of testimony of what God has done in our lives. We know He's done it before, and we know He'll do it again. If you think God is being slow to act, He's probably preparing you for the plans and purposes He has in store for you. He's preparing you so that you're ready to receive His promises, just like the Israelites. God could not take them directly from Egypt into the promised land. They weren't ready to receive those promises in full. They needed to be prepared. They needed to receive the law so that they knew how they should live in this new land, so that they knew what they should do to be the chosen people of God, to be God's holy people. So the second principle is to lay down your expectations. Don't give up on them, lay them down, and wait upon the Lord. Now, the third and final principle is to pick up God's declarations, or in other words, to cling to His promises. Moses' successor, now we move on, as the leader of Israel was a man called Joshua, a mighty warrior who demonstrated amazing bravery, and his faith was also incredible. On so many occasions, he faced uncertainty. He spent most of his life facing adversity, setbacks, disappointments. Most of his life was a battle, but he never stopped believing that God would keep His promises. And by the end of his life, he saw God's faithfulness come to pass. He is probably one of the best examples of someone who clung to God's promises through uncertain times. And his final words to Israel are a beautiful testimony to this fact. We read in Joshua 23. There we read that, you have seen everything the Lord your God has done for you during my lifetime. The Lord your God has fought for you against your enemies. And he goes on, and later on he says, deep in your hearts, you know that every promise of the Lord your God has come true. Not a single one has failed. And finally, he warns them to keep the covenant of the Lord. This is Joshua's final address to the leaders of Israel. You see, This is evidence that Joshua's mind was always filled with God's promises. And the thoughts you fill your mind with are crucial, because what you cling to influences your worldview. Listen to that carefully again. What you cling to influences your worldview. If you don't cling to God's promises, if you don't think about them, you may even miss out on recognizing what He's doing. But if you dwell on His promises, you start to recognize God's blessings during uncertain times. It's apparent from Joshua's words, the way that he says it, is that not every fulfillment of God's promises was obvious to everyone. He says they have to look deep. If you know that deep in your souls, deep in your hearts, you know that every promise of the Lord has been fulfilled. You see, sometimes God does the miraculous, and there's no denying that His promise is being fulfilled. But many times, oftentimes, and especially during times of uncertainty, we have to look carefully. We have to search our own hearts and souls. And when you look more carefully, you can acknowledge that God is, and in many cases, He already has fulfilled His promises. So I want to say to you today, pick up God's declarations as you face the uncertain future that awaits you. Reflect on God's promises meaningfully. In context, we're often quite good at taking promises out of context, but reflect on them meaningfully. But there's so many promises that are for every single one of us. And you might even find that some of them have already been fulfilled. Now, when you identify and when you recognize that fulfillment, let that fulfillment transform your mind and build your faith. Some of the best promises to think about is God will sustain you. He's promised He will sustain you. Or has He already been sustaining you through this tough period? God's peace will guard your heart. God will instruct you in the way you should go. He will be your refuge and strength. Or has He already been your refuge and strength? Has He already been an ever-present help in times of need? I'm sure there are plenty of examples you can think of. Another promise about God's love is that His perfect love will cast out all fear. And that same love we promised that nothing can separate us from that love. Not sickness, not death, and certainly not times of uncertainty. Recognize what God is doing. Don't wallow in the waiting and the disappointment and the anxiety of uncertainty. Recognize what God is doing now. Remember what He's done and cling to those promises. Remember that God is not done. He's not done with me. He's not done with you. And at the risk of quoting someone who wasn't a Christian, but John Lennon said, "It will all be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end." But while God is still busy with us, we will face uncertain times. So we need to firstly acknowledge our own limitations by clinging to Him and allowing Him or allowing trusted people to come alongside us. We need to secondly lay down our expectations and wait on Him. And then we need to pick up His declarations and promises, acknowledging and praising Him for those that have already been fulfilled. Recognize those that have been fulfilled. But then going forward, we need to trust deep in our hearts that He who began a good work will carry it on until the day of Christ Jesus. He will finish what He started. And that, church, is how we are to face these uncertain times. Seek God, plan ahead, and know that He will direct your steps as you cling to His promises. Let's pray.